Right, morning guys. We're moving on now. We're moving on to biology. I'm picking up a bit of this because then we'll get to the end of term. We'll get everything covered. So I'm picking up on the biodiversity part, and what we're going to be looking at really is what biodiversity is. You want to be able to define what it is, but also look at the importance of biodiversity, to explain why it's important we have it, how great biodiversity maintains food supplies and shelter for organisms and maintains the physical environment. And then describe examples of how a reduction in biodiversity can affect climate, food supplies for humans, useful chemicals for the future, etc. But the important part of this really is the human part. How is it that we are affecting biodiversity? Because we are. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at today. So if you can get that done by today, that would be marvellous. So let's whiz through it. Right. Before we start then, I've got 3 questions for you to have a think about. And I'm going to put the answers up in a second. You've got the PowerPoint, so you can cheat and have a look. But there's a couple of links at the bottom there. So if you want to pause, have a look, have a think, that's absolutely fine. Right, but let's have a look. In reverse order, population of Uttoxeter at the last census was 13,089. Now that number will have changed. It's almost certainly gone up. But that's the size of Uttoxeter. The global population is about 7.8 billion people. Now if you look at this as a live link, you will see this number increasing. It counts day on day on day. You can see the number changing live. So we have a huge population on our planet. Huge population, and this leads to certain problems. If we look at the most populous places, the countries with the highest population, China, no surprise, is number 1. China has somewhere in the region of 1.4 billion people on it. Which is a huge percentage. Not far behind that is India with 1.3 billion, 1.38 billion. Then the US, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Russia, Mexico. So we don't even make it into the top 10. We're quite a small nation actually, with somewhere in the region of about 68 million people. So we have a planet that has a lot of people on it. We are very heavily populated, and this is problematic to our environment. Why? Let's have a look first. Let's look at world population development. So again, there were 5 questions there. Pause the video, have a go at those 5 questions and see how you get on. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at those. So what does that graph tell you? Well, it shows you that the population is increasing very, very quickly. The word for that is exponentially, but you can see that since 1950 the population has boomed. And you can see that it's primarily in developing countries. So the in industrialised nations, or first world countries perhaps you might call them, the population expansion is virtually linear, but in developing countries it has massively increased. So what's the world population in 2050? Reading across, that's going to be somewhere in the 10 billion people region. So what problems are there going to be with that? Well, problems are going to be things like overpopulation. Where's everyone going to live? Food production is going to be a problem. Because whilst the population growth is exponential, our ability to grow food is not. Cannot exponentially increase the amount of food on the planet. So there's a problem. So we're going to have problems with sort of just finding a place for people to live, but also being able to produce enough food for them. Is this growth sustainable? No. Is the long and short of it? Absolutely not. So what do we think the population will be in 2100? Well, again, if you sort of increase that, follow that line up, we're probably going to be in the 12 to 13 billion people, assuming it follows that trend. Now, chances are it won't, because we simply won't be able to sustain that level of life on the planet. So, why is this a problem? How does this lead to what we're looking at today? So, we have what we call exponential growth on the planet. And what that means is it's a non-linear growth. So, the larger it is, the faster it grows. Okay? We say that's exponential, a bit like a hockey stick. You get a curve upwards. An exponential curve is where the greater it is, the greater it increases. Okay, and that's an upward curve. That's a real problem in this case. Okay, and if we have a look at human population growth and where we are, well, you can see that actually it's been very recently we've had a big growth. So if you look at the Stone Age, and you look at the Bronze Age, you look at the Iron Age, and then the Middle Ages, population growth did not increase greatly. Why has it increased so much recently? Largely down to medicine. Medicine and education. People are able to live much longer lives because they eat more nutritious diets. there is still a significant amount of poverty on the planet, but there is a significant amount of better healthcare and education, which allows people to make better health choices. So there is a reason there as well. But this is an issue for our environment, because we're going to place a much greater drain on the environment. So if you want to have a look at this link in the PowerPoint I've put below, feel free to follow that and have a look through it. That's really quite a useful link there. But there are some definitions you need to learn. Number one, biodiversity, what we're looking at today. It's the variety of all the different species of organisms on Earth or within an ecosystem. So it's the number and type of different species. Okay. Another one, which you've done before, is community. All the populations of organisms that live together and interact in the same area. If you think about Eutoxeter as a community, we would talk about that in terms of human beings. But actually, a better definition would be including the cats, the dogs, the mouse, the rats, the birds, the beetles, everything. That would be the community, all those organisms that live together and interact. Population is the number of organisms of a species. So we talk about the population of Eutoxeter, we really mean the population of people, 13,000 give or take. We're not counting the mice, we're not counting the birds, we're not counting the squirrels. Okay, and an ecosystem. This is the system including the organisms in an area and how they interact, along with this sort of non-living things. So you've done biotic and abiotic already, looking at a biotic factory outside, the birds are just hovering by the door. But things like rainfall, temperature and the soil, that's the ecosystem. It's the surroundings for that sort of that community. Okay, so why is this an important thing to look at? Well, ecosystems are really important because they provide clean air, they provide water, they provide soil, minerals, plants, etc., on which we depend. Okay, these are called ecosystem services, right? And we need to make sure that those ecosystem services are sustainable. Now, we did sustainability in chemistry, you might remember, when we looked at resources. Sustainability is important. It means that the needs of the present are met without affecting the ecosystem services for future generations. It means we get what we need, but we leave enough of it for future generations. That's really what sustainability means. And the problem is because we have such large population growth, because population growth is exponential, that means that we are putting more pressure on the natural environment, and that is where we start to have problems, what we call environmental degradation, and that leads to a loss of biodiversity. Right? And as biodiversity leads us to good ecosystem services, the more pressure we put on, the worse it is for us. So, what is biodiversity? Well, if we have a look at this environment here, this is traditional English woodland. Now, if you were to leave Britain, right, and not touch it and not farm it and not do anything else, eventually it's going to revert back to this state. Any forested area will eventually revert back to English woodland, which is primarily oak and similar sort of deciduous stuff. And what we've got there is a huge biodiversity. There's lots of different organisms there. There's wood, there's sort of grass and bushes and things, and lots of organisms can live there. So you've got a blue tit there, you've got a badger, you've got what looks suspiciously like a wren or possibly a house sparrow. You've got deer, you've got owls, you've got a little spider up there. But there's lots of different organisms, and they can all live in the same thing. There's a lot of different difference of biological things there. And they all feed off each other, you get food webs and all the rest of it. Now, if we start to reduce the biodiversity, so if I go down a little bit and start cutting down some of the trees. Why are we cutting down trees? Well, two reasons. One, we want farmland. So we take away some of the trees, we can use that land for farming. Two, we want to use it for building. So we cut it down there. What that does then is that starts to reduce the amount of biodiversity in the system there. You can see this chap over here in the corner with the rather weird horned helmet. So this is probably when we first started in the Middle Ages, sort of really quite turning land into farmland, possibly a little bit earlier. So as we go down a bit further, we've chopped down a little bit more. You can see that some of the wildlife is starting to go. There's not enough density of woodland there for the deer, for example. Okay, cut back a little bit more. Again, we're significantly increasing our farming land. That cuts down on the biodiversity there. So on we go, and you can see that as we start to remove the natural habitat, starting to build factories and all the rest of it, the number of organisms that can live in that area are very low. Okay, and what we're doing there is a number of things. We're cutting down trees, we're increasing farming land, increasing land for building. And that increases the pollution as well. So we're chucking pollution into the atmosphere, we're chucking pollution into the waterways, which is also killing organisms and reducing biodiversity. And we'll look at pollution next time. We'll look at the effects of human pollution on that. And as we go right the way down, eventually we get to a point where we've cleared out most of it, and you'll get a few birds there living in gardens and all the rest of it, but very little else survives. Okay, so biodiversity is important, and we're affecting it. So biodiversity is the number and variety of organisms found in an area. So that's different species, the different types of bird, animals, etc., and variations within that species, genetic variation. And it's important that we have biodiversity. Back at 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were wiped out in a mass extinction event. Now, that mass extinction event may or may not have been an asteroid that hit Mexico. The evidence suggests that it probably was. But it destroyed 90% of life on the planet. But because it didn't destroy everything, plants survived, mammals survived, certain fish survived, reptiles survived, and we have where we are now. We've evolved from that. Now, without that biodiversity, if we hadn't had mammals that had evolved at that point, would we have been able to survive as a sort of species? Would we have evolved from that? And the answer is probably not. So biodiversity is really important, but human beings are putting a huge amount of pressure on it because we're taking away land that we need for building. We're using land for agriculture. We're using it for landfill sites, and that causes a huge loss of biodiversity, which means the planet is not going to be able to sustain significant events like a mass extinction event, for example. We're making species extinct by taking away their habitat. Lots and lots of organisms now are in serious decline because we're taking away their habitat, and that's a problem because we need biodiversity to cope with environmental changes. Okay, when global warming hits and we run out of sort of a lot of useful land, and we have all sorts of extreme weather events, certain organisms will survive that, certain ones won't, and they will become extinct. So we have a problem with our overuse of certain resources. So our use is not sustainable. We're overfishing, there's huge amounts of deforestation, particularly at the moment. And we can unbalance this sort of closed loop system of ecosystems. So we're burning fossil fuels, which took millions of years to form. We're using a much faster rate, which is not sustainable. Our emissions include carbon-based outputs that are not used in the ecosystem at the same rate, which leads to global warming and climate change. Again, we'll look at that later. So all of these things are massively problematic. So your task is there are some exam questions. It's about 15 minutes worth of work. I'd like to answer those on ecosystems and biodiversity. They're really looking more at sort of what biodiversity is and how we are affecting it and why this is a problem. So have a go at those for me, guys. Any problems, you know how to get hold of me. Other than that, I will see you all later. Take care.